Welcome everyone to today's session, Opening the Door to an Inclusive Ministry Creates a Transfigured Church. A few very brief words about me. My name is Sarah Henchy Brosnan, and I've been a member of Dignity since the 2015 Seattle conference. And I've been working with the programming committees for each of the past 3 national conferences. In May of this year, I graduated with the Master's of Divinity degree from Chicago Theological Seminary. And I've moved to Houston, Texas to start a clinical pastoral education residency, working towards a vocation as a pediatric chaplain. I firmly believe that as a church and Dignity becomes more radically hospitable and inclusive of the gifts of all, it will lead to the shalom and the community of joy that Brian Massengale spoke of powerfully in his keynote address. I look forward to hearing from each of our distinguished panelists about how we get there. But first, a few brief housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, and Dignity USA will be making it available online in various ways in the future. Anyone whose camera is on could show up in the recording. If you do not want to be in the recording, please make sure to leave your camera turned off during the entire workshop. The session can have a maximum of 20 people on camera at a time, including the panelists. So if you turn your camera off, it's likely you'll only be visible for only part of the session. If you'd like to type a question, please type it in the Q&A section using the tabs on the right side of your screen. Participants can also give a thumbs up to the posted questions. The more thumbs up the question gets, the higher it will be in priority. We have a wonderful moderator, Jason, with us, and if you experience any issues that the moderator cannot resolve, please have the moderator reach out to help desk, and we'll try to sit as quickly as possible. So we're going to have our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Deb, then followed by Brian, then Mary, and then Kashna. And then they'll have time to address the topic. And then there'll be time for dialogue between myself and the panelists, and we'll end with time for audience questions. Kasha, could you try introducing yourself?
Yes. Let me see if this works. Can I just get a head nod or a thumbs up that technology is in my favor? Okay. I have been graced. Hi, everyone. My name is Kasha, she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from uptown Chicago, where I've lived for about the last 3 years. I have 1 class left to finish my Master's of Divinity and Social Justice dual degree at Loyola Institute of Pastoral Studies here in the city. That program has just been a gift where I've been able to focus on what it means to not only be a part of the church, but to be church as a young queer woman studying in a degree that usually leads to ordination in other denominations and in other fields, and knowing that I am all in and not fully accepted in. And that has been really a journey for me and a lot of my other counterparts in the program. Outside of school and here in the city, I organize with 46 Ward Neighbors Against Police Violence. I've been a part of the Black Abolitionist Network and talking about how to do White Caucus spacing. In my local Call to Action chapter, I facilitate nuns and nuns. So a lot of intergenerational work on what does it mean to be church? How do we show up? What does our table look like? And where do we put our bodies beyond Sunday? So that's a little bit of what I'm doing. I have recently accepted the position of the Director of Social and Environmental Justice for the Congregation of St. Joseph Sisters. And that has looked like campus tours and going across the Midwest to understand the power and legacy of our women religious communities. We've added a whole new dynamic to some of these questions I have about empowering the lady and gender inclusion. And now I'm really looking forward to focus on anti-racism in a more equitable church and what that means primarily for predominantly white institutions. So, amen. Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you. Let's try Mary. Mary seems to be unmuted.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
All right.
Wonderful. To introduce myself, I'm in the western suburbs of Chicago right now. I used to live a half a block out of the city limits and moved about 6 years ago. Some stuff about me, not necessarily in any particular order. I was ordained a priest for the Old Catholic Church on May 24th of 1987. I've been the pastor of a small, vibrant community. I've worked as a home health and hospice chaplain, helped to create the first PADS, which is public action to deliver shelter site within the city limits of Chicago. I served for 20 years with the Illinois State Police as a chaplain. I'm a member of Dignity Chicago. I worked with the AIDS Pastoral Care Network in Chicago way back in the beginnings when AIDS was just an enormous crisis. I've been a chaplain at a residential treatment center for adolescents, musician, liturgist, wife, mom, and grandma. I'm a certified animal assistant therapy and education person, a dog trainer, and a canine behavior consultant. Most notable, I guess, right now, today with the anniversary, I served for a month at Ground Zero as a supervisory chaplain from November to December, and also at the plane crash in the Rockaways at the Javits Center. While I was at Ground Zero, I worked on the pile at the temporary morgue and the respite centers. For my family of origin, my grandparents came over from Eastern Europe on both sides. And from those roots, we all kind of branched out. And now my second cousins and first cousins include LGBTQI. We have people of color in our blood, and I cannot tell you how wonderful it is. I feel like the move from Europe and Eastern Europe was probably the most wonderful thing that ever happened to our family. I'm really happy to be here and share with everybody. Okay. When I was approached about this, some of my first thoughts in, looking towards the future and inclusivity, I started looking for something kind of pithy to start out my little section with. And I looked through a lot of different things, and what I came up with is a children's book. Now, it's interesting to note that the children's book was written in 1952. This is the cover to it. And the cover says, "A hole is to dig." And the very first page in the book says, "Mashed potatoes are to give everybody enough." And that's what I think our challenge going forward in the future towards inclusivity, reaching out. Even the way I'm dressed today, I'm wearing a collar. So that could put somebody off. It could make somebody approach. There's a whole lot of things. Most people aren't used to seeing the neck in the collar on a female. That in itself can be really shocking. But the mashed potatoes are to give everybody enough is going to take an awful lot of creativity. I do believe that not only the events of 9/11 20 years ago and what that's done to us as a country and a people, but also what's going on now with the pandemic have been crises for sure. There have been all kinds of crises in the church as a whole, but what it's been, in addition to an awful lot of sadness and brokenness, is it's also pushed our creativity to places that we never, ever imagined we might go as a society, getting to know people that we didn't before because of where we find ourselves today in this technologically damning and blessing kind of a situation. I think that looking towards, and I mean, I was born in 1954, so you can do the math. Being a senior citizen and looking out at the people who now are leading the way in technology, you know, the younger generation, I think that there's a wonderful convergence that's coming about from the aspect of the times that I grew up in and the experiences that I had and the values that I held to kids that are growing up and can talk to people all over the world and may not have grown up in the same kind of situation where I knew everybody in my little world, in my town, that sort of thing. And I think it's the incorporation of technology, the ability to be anywhere in the world at any time, and also looking in that connection towards Europe and different countries where their lifestyles are so different from ours. My husband would go back and forth to Sweden to work, and he would remark on just the work day there. You would punch in, do your work, and you would leave when you were there. That was your work. That was your job. Your life was something else altogether. And I think that we're beginning to see that where work, your job doesn't dictate your life, that there are more things to be shared, and that the church isn't confined by walls, that the church can be met out in the park. It can be at a concert. It can be involved in ways we haven't even dreamed of. The community can be experienced on a very, very small level and on an enormous one. And it's how can we be creative to be more inclusive? We're using technology to be able to not just kind of, you know, put our hands up against the fact that we can't be in person, but also to open the doors to a wider audience that could possibly never, ever dream of participating, that could never, ever risk walking into one of our gatherings for a multitude of reasons that can't be reached in any other way. And I find this very exciting and frustrating. And out of that frustration comes so many opportunities like this to be able to expand and grow and include and learn and share. That even the most despicable of our neighbors still has the seed of God planted within and still deserves to be respected and included and cherished. Next.
Yeah, thanks so much. I don't know if we have Sarah in the room, so I see that Brian is muted and Sarah's MIA and Deb is gone. So I might just take a moment to also speak on the theme of opening doors to an inclusive ministry. Mary, you, I think, set up something really powerful for me. I grew up a pretty angry atheist, and I think it was out of hurt and anger. at the church. And when I was in college, I accidentally attended a 4-year private liberal arts college, Catholic, and accidentally ended up working in campus ministry for 4 years, which accidentally led me to meet the Dominican nuns, and a campus worker who took me to the Catholic worker for the first time. And there is something about God's sense of humor and the Spirit's stubborn will to say you're allowed to heal, and you're allowed to take space for your healing. When I think about the topic of an inclusive ministry, I'm almost upset because my gut instinct is to say it's already happening. It's just not in the four walls of the institutional church. And I don't think, I think I'm preaching to the choir at Dignity when I say that. When I say we are empowered and we are God created and we are loved, kind of regardless of what comes from the institution. But what's striking to me is how painful it is to watch the moral authority of the church, of the USCCB fall. And I think, part of me growing up as an angry atheist would have really, adored that and wanted that. And I think it's harmful and it's scary because it's oppressive. It needs to happen. I recently just wrote a paper on abolition of the Catholic Church. Pretty excited about it. Pretty excited to develop that theme. But what I'm seeing is, and what I hope to convey a little bit today, is that we have movements of inclusive ministry around us happening from a deeply Catholic tradition. For example, nuns and sisters and women religious who have been dedicating their lives pre and post Vatican II to serving in hospitals, in schools, in ministries of tending to the poor and, quite honestly, the oppressed of our own community, where they have risen up in a moral authority outside of a civil authority, a civic authority outside of the government, and sometimes outside of the church itself to show God's love. I think that is pretty inarguable. Another is the Catholic worker community. When I was in Los Angeles, the Catholic worker was kind of my spiritual home there. And the idea that we pass bread not only to the hungry, but to one another, and to any visiting priest who is willing to come and say liturgy in the living room, which was then converted into the dining room, which was then the chapel, right? I think we have these sacred spaces among us. And another, and my most kind of poignant for today, is when I was working with the Black Abolitionist Network here in Chicago, which is a constellation of organizers and artists and healers. Prior to the uprisings of 2020, we were talking about what it means to care for one another, what it means to love one another. And during the uprisings, there was a confirmation of the principles of unity. And I know that an abolitionist, Black-led, queer-led, women-led space can be intimidating if we're used to following the moral authority of a heteronormative, white supremacist, patriarchal society. But in this space, our principles of unity included, we believe in abundance. We uplift radical new forms of community. The demands to defund the police were the demands to actually feed the hungry, house the homeless, visit the sick, abolish the prisons. These are the corporal works of mercy. And when we talk about what it means to physically embody and live the gospel, we have examples of inclusive ministries around us right now in women religious communities, in Catholic worker communities, in abolitionist organizers, in community healers, in people who are willing to say what we have is not just. And I think that, I can be so disheartened by the fall of the moral authority. And at the same time, it's the very thing that's going to happen. The church, I believe, is gutting itself of its own mission when it sits and excludes and sits and exploits and doesn't lament for its history, doesn't grieve over its loss, and doesn't stand up when there is something happening. Oscar Romero says in situations of life or death, if we are not neutral, people are dying. And the healing practices are being politicized. People are dying, and we're not stepping up to say, here's a better solution. People are dying, and we're turning a blind eye to hate and harm that causes some of these deaths. I think we have the inclusive ministries around us. I think what we need to do is honor them as sacred and bless the communion that's being offered to us at the table. And maybe it's not the table we grew up at, but maybe it's the table we need to accept our invitation to. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks, Kasha, and thank you for taking over there for a second when I kind of had technical difficulties. I'm going to launch into a few of the questions that I have, and then hopefully we're working on getting Brian in so Brian can speak to us, and hopefully maybe Deb as well. We have great tech folks, and I'm sorry about the tech breakdown. I'm just going to launch into some questions, and hopefully I don't freeze up again. So I think Mary was speaking to this a little bit, but what do we think that the global COVID-19 pandemic has taught us about being a more inclusive, open church and how we need to be hospitable in new ways? Either Mary or Kashna.
I can just, in 2 sentences, go off of where I kind of just left off. I think the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that we have to make an idol of the church at hand. I think that when it comes to people dying and people being hungry and people losing housing, the gospel and the corporal works of mercy are very clear as to what it means to be in communion with one another. And we continue to have people hungry and homeless and dying. And I think that that's a great loss to the gospel, and that's a great loss for our community.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you, Kasha. I really do. I think that the doors to opportunity and the necessity to keep pushing to depoliticize this whole mess, and it is a mess. It's so few have so much, and so many go without. And if nothing else has ever pointed this out, this has. We live in a country right now where we're trying to cajole, bribe, pick a word, people into doing what they need to do, not just for themselves, but more importantly, looking beyond ourselves to our neighbors, so that they don't get sick, so that if they are sick, they are taken care of and taken care of well. We have to look at us all as a community and not just an us and them any longer, because this illness doesn't separate us out. And it's as if we were all given permission to run around with loaded guns. Well, how many of us are willing to put the ammunition down? It's going to cost us something, but if we don't, it's going to cost us so much more.
I definitely feel that being in Texas, that gun metaphor really, and new to Texas, that gun metaphor really rang true for me. And we're also here seeing the consequences of people acting really individually and not in community. Mm-hmm. In so many areas in life. And I think really communities like Dignity have shown to be an antidote to some of that. I apologize, I disconnected during part of your talk, Mary, but did you talk at all about kind of the early days of the AIDS crisis, which was before my time, but and how Dignity communities kind of banded together in different ways? And can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. Back at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, when the whole world was taking this gargantuan step in fear away and ostracizing people, there were some really wonderful groups and communities that came together. And it wasn't in the kind of numbers necessarily that we see now. It was smaller numbers because we didn't have the kind of communication skills that we do now, where we can, be anywhere at any time. But what I did see in some of the communities I was involved in, one was the AIDS Pastoral Care Network, and the other was when I was working as a chaplain in home health and hospice, plus a small community that I was pastoring at the time. We would go out, not wait for people to come to us, but we would go out and step in and literally become the families of those people who were suffering from AIDS, because families were walking away from their children, their spouses, you name it. And we literally moved in with others. In fact, there was St. Catherine of Genoa Catholic Worker House was very active. Their whole ministry was to take people literally off the streets that had AIDS, bring them in so that they had a place to die, that would have a community that fed them not just food, but that healing touch that became so hard to find because we knew so little then. In our own community, we had one person that was dying, and her family just completely abandoned her. And what we ended up doing was taking turns and becoming her family so she could stay in her own home with her niece that she was caring for. And we cooked, we cleaned. Somebody was there with her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And this was within a community of less than 20 people.
Wow, that's pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that strikes me is that that's a lot like how the early church communities took care of each other. And if you want to talk about some of that from what you know of that, I think Deb was going to speak to that a little bit, but Deb hasn't gotten in yet. So,
in the early church, I think really just looking towards our Jewish brothers and sisters, we see such a wonderful example of what it means to live out your faith, because family and home and community are everything. I was just talking with somebody the other day and saying most Catholics, and present company excluded always, there's a lot of Catholics running around with a lot of degrees who their faith life is based on a foundation of the last sacrament that they made when they were growing up as kids. And that's where their education stopped, at least within their religious education. Within the Jewish community, there never has been a time for that. Every part of life is part of the faith. There's no way of looking at sacred versus secular. It's all one. And it's how the Jewish people have worked within it. Yes, there are some exceptions to that, but by and large, it's as strong as the blood in your system. And in those early communities, after Jesus, they were Jews first. It's, went to the temple, to the synagogue, they went about their lives, and then they gathered the next day for a meal together, for the Eucharist, for the breaking of bread. But it never left out the breaking open of the word and the breaking open and sharing of what was going on in their lives. Never. Even within the work that I've done, where I've been involved in chaplaincy in all different kinds of areas, there are a couple wonderful Orthodox Jewish rabbis that I've worked with regularly. And honestly, to see the way that they approach life and the people that they're with, one of them goes out of his way to conduct a ministry that reaches out to imprisoned Jews. It's like, want to see a neglected community? Go to a jail and find a Jew. They have nobody and nothing. Their families leave them. You're so ostracized. And yet he makes sure that they have everything that they need to be as fully Jewish, not just in heritage, but in ritual and everything. And then there's another rabbi that's wonderful, where he walks around at different things, and this is within the police ministry. And I can remember standing, kind of watching him operate. And he's so clever. He'll walk up to police officers or their families and he'll say, hi, you want to, it's like, how's it going and stuff. And sometimes they just sort of shrug him off, like, I'm too tough for this. And he goes, yeah, well, I know you're a busy person, but, and he reaches in his pocket and he pulls out a little piece of candy. His pockets are bulging with candy all the time. And he says, hey, would you like a mint? And it's like, nah, Rabbi, that's okay. I don't need one. And to some of the toughest guys in the world, he'll go, well, I dipped it in Viagra. And it's like, oh, well, in that case, I'll take it. But he's clever. He opens the door to a relationship and a conversation. And that's what brings about community. That's what brings about Eucharist, whether it's in the four walls of a church brick and mortar building, or it's happening in the park with a bunch of homeless people and you're sitting around and eating PB&Js because somebody in a car came by and handed a bunch of them out. You can have as profound an experience of Eucharist in that moment as you can when you gather with your community, wherever you do. And without those experiences, when we walk back into the brick and mortar buildings, as it starts to happen, if we don't bring that with us, if we don't bring what we've learned from this pandemic,
I'm on. Okay.
we aren't going to have as full an experience of
great.
Eucharist.
All right.
Brian, yay!
Yes.
Woo!
Yay! Let's hear
Is it
from
my
Brian.
turn?
I'm
Is
so
it my
excited.
turn to go?
Yeah.
All right.
Introduce yourself and then
Yes,
talk
I'll do
about
that quickly. I'm Brian Bromberg. I'm an ordained Roman Catholic deacon in the Archdiocese of San Francisco since 2005. I served at different churches. The most well-known, the people know, is Most Holy Redeemer, which is in the Castro, and it's primarily an LGBTQ parish within the diocese with all the problems that involves. I've helped out with Dignity, and I'm also a journalist. I write for the Bay Area Reporter, which is the weekly LGBTQ newspaper here in San Francisco. So, which has caused me a lot of problems with my Archbishop, Cordileone, who I'm sure you all know. He's the one leading the charge to get any politicians that support abortion not receive the Eucharist. So anyway, so on that, I will start. Mark was a gay community activist involved with the deaf, hearing impaired and 12-step recovery communities who lived off the grid, sometimes homeless, sleeping in doorways. He spent half the year in San Francisco, and while here attending Dignity, and the other half in Austin, Texas. Dignity members paid for individual night stays in local hotels during bad weather. When he had no shelter for the night, He stored his suitcases in their car trunks for 1 to 2 months and occasionally provided meals if needed. The chapter paid for a yearly permanent address mailbox, including back payment of unpaid rent. We helped with paperwork so he could receive health care and Social Security through San Francisco. Mark could be loud and abrasive, angrily shouting out very long prayer requests. Still, he was always treated as a full, loved member of Dignity San Francisco. I tell this story because it's the future of Dignity, an example of announcing good news in the form of radical hospitality. Hospitality here means welcoming other people and valuing them for who they are, as they are, not remaking them into what we want them to be, but surrendering our biases and conditions and willing to make their interests and concerns our own, to care about their well-being. Hospitality breaks down barriers, so by inviting others into our own world, we agree to enter their world. We extend the same hospitality to others that God has shown us because God first loved us unconditionally. Hospitality enables us to see God's presence in everyone out of a sense of gratitude because we are witnessing a unique and exciting aspect of God's creation. 2 weeks ago, I preached on Mark's story of the religious leaders, asking Jesus why his disciples didn't wash their hands before eating. This is religion as separation, categorizing people into groups, those who are acceptable and those who aren't, excluding people considered dirty or contaminated. These same purity rules applied to sexuality today in our church have been used to oppress queer people. Tradition and ritual are valued over mercy and compassion. Jesus' answer to the religious authorities is to abolish their categorizing people into in and out groups. He's creating a new paradigm for how human beings should act towards each other. For Jesus, there's only one group, and all are equal, vulnerable, flawed human beings who are also children of God. There can no longer be an us versus them mentality, since there's only we. Today, the nation is commemorating the 20th anniversary of 9/11. This resulted in the ultimate us versus them polarization, leading to failed wars with Iraq and Afghanistan, killing and emotionally crippling thousands, hate crimes and torture of Muslims, squandering any moral authority the United States had. What was once an external enemy was projected inward, resulting in bitter partisanship, political divisiveness, racial disparity, social media bullying, and governmental paralysis. This same us versus them binary prevents us from ending the COVID pandemic as well as dealing effectively with climate change. And of course, we can't forget the more than 200 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced into state legislatures this year, many of them church-supported, with 70 of them prohibiting trans kids from participating in sports or having access to restrooms or locker rooms consistent with their gender identity. What good news can Dignity offer a homophobic and transphobic institutional church? We can model the radical hospitality and rejection of the us versus them theology. We can offer an alternative gospel vision on a micro level that embraces both diversity and inclusion. In 2017, when Trump ordered a travel ban on citizens from 7 Muslim countries, several Dignity members protested at our SFO airport. Dignity San Francisco for years sponsored a lecture series with speakers from other spiritual traditions so we could hear what it means to be queer for them, and not surprisingly, they experienced similar trials and joys as we do in Catholicism. Due to the pandemic, we canceled last year's in-person Thanksgiving dinner, but we hand-delivered turkey meals to all who requested it because they are our family. The good news is that we can be the good news for those in our own faith communities by meeting the needs of our members, just as we help Mark, which is love in action, proclaiming gospel values. Because our numbers are small, we can know each other on a more personal, intimate level, touching people when and where they are most vulnerable, transforming them and us. We find and reflect God's love in the relationships we develop with each other. receiving God's blessing, no matter what the Vatican says. Spiritual author Phyllis Tickle argues that Christianity is currently undergoing a massive upheaval as part of a regular pattern occurring every 500 years in which old ideas are rejected and new ones emerge, revitalizing Christianity. So in 1500, we had the Protestant Reformation. Well, in the 2000s, Christianity is entering a post-denominational era with a distrust of institutions, less hierarchy, and more communal. We are seeing the birth of small faith communities, not based on doctrine, but on spiritual practices such as meditation or yoga or centering prayer, or social justice ministries to the homeless or refugees that are interfaith and ecumenical, transcending any religious borders. Dignity often functions as a small faith community, so it can be a leader in this emergent church movement, utilizing the spiritual gifts LGBTQ people bring. And I'm using the list, although I've modified it and changed it a bit, that New Ways Ministry printed out. These include truth-telling, as we shared the news of who we are sometimes to those who didn't want to hear it. Courage, with a willingness to accept, affirm, and celebrate the way God created us in spite of opposition. Comfort with diversity, willing to scale walls and build bridges to the marginalized and outcast, whomever they are. And then the role of conscience in making choices that may be contrary to church teaching. Challenging problematic gender and sexual norms as queer people explore more authentic and alternative forms of relationships with others. And finally, a strong personal relationship with God to fortify and help us overcome discrimination and rejection, both by the institutional church and society at large. These spiritual gifts allow us to mirror what healthy sexual and spiritual integration looks like to the mainstream church, and encouraging them to discontinue their us versus them mentality and embrace Jesus' umbrella model of vulnerable, flawed, equal children of God, dependent on a merciful, intersectional Abba, crossing all barriers of race, gender, sexuality, disability, and religion. Whatever differences we may share, we are the same in the common experience of being human and in our need for compassion. To paraphrase Gandhi, we are the hope we've been waiting for by becoming the change we want to see in the larger church, making it more hospitable so all the marks of our world can feel welcome and valued at God's table. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So glad that we were finally able to work with our tech team and get you in.
Thank you.
Blessing of God for those wonderful people on the tech team.
Yes.
So I wanted to give the panelists the opportunity to ask each other questions. So if each of you, starting with Kasha, have one question to ask either one of your other panelists. And if we have time, we'll do another, after we do audience questions, we'll do another round of that, but start with one.
I feel a little like I need a minute to digest what Brian just offered us. I'm so grateful you were able to hop on audio and share that with us, because there's so many beautiful images swirling in my mind from that. And I guess I have perhaps a softball that I will throw to both of you, which is a question of where have you been finding spiritual nourishment? And honestly, I will even limit it to this week. Like, I would love to know right now, in the midst of the bullshit that is the current world, how and where are you finding spiritual nourishment?
Is that to me or to the whole panel? Or
I would say to both you and Mary,
okay.
But Brian, if you're ready.
Actually, I believe it or not, I mean, you know, I'm a journalist, of course, and so I'm very keyed into the news. But you know, I've learned to find where the positive news is, because news in general, you know, focuses, of course, usually on the bad things, and yet, to me, there's always resistance. You know, you have to. There is resistance to, you know, all the bad things we hear about. And like, for example, this past week, you know, you had, you know, again, the continuing fallout of Afghanistan, and yet there were planes where Americans were still able to get out, in spite of the fact that, technically after the 31st, you weren't allowed to do that, So, I mean, there's good people always working behind the scenes, but they're often invisible. You don't hear about them, but they're there, and they're doing, real, it's really a kind of ministry. And that's what I chose to focus in. I mean, it's like, again, I've learned to, there's always going to be bad news. I mean, in the climate change, although luckily, again, a good news is that Lake Tahoe is not going up in flames after all, So, I mean, that's good news, So, I mean, that's what I again, and I'm not a Pollyanna person, I can assure you. I definitely have a very strong cynical head. And there are times when I scream, where is the divine present in all of this? And yet then invariably something, I'll be led in, or I'll read a story, or I'll hear about somebody that's doing something, that's contrary to all that bad stuff. And that's what I choose to focus on. So I don't know. It's very broad. I'm sorry. I wish I could be more specific, but that's kind of my view of how to deal with a constant barrage of bad news. So
I'm going to interject here. I think that's probably okay. I really feel that theme of good news in my life. I mean, I work at a hospital. We hear so many bad stories. It's the busiest trauma center in the United States, the hospital I work at. So there's a lot of bad things that happen every day. But just the other day, we heard about a 5-month-old baby who was born in the NICU, was not expected to make it, and is now going home tomorrow. And that's such a thing of beauty. And I think it's a reminder that as we do this really hard work of opening the doors to more inclusive ministry, to find those moments that nourish us. So, Mary, did you have any moments that nourished you this week?
Believe it or not, I'm the kid that would color within the lines until I get tired of it, and then I start going out and doing other things. Not that anyone could tell. My nourishment comes from, and this is going to sound crazy, I love to go to the barn. In my early 60s, we took the plunge. I should say I took the plunge, and I got a horse for one of our granddaughters. Well, granddaughter works full time, and she's in school and everything, and can't take care of the horse, so it falls on me. And I go over to the barn literally every day for either a very short time, and sometimes I'm really, really lucky and can spend a couple hours out there just goofing off with the horse. But the goofing off consists of learning to speak the horse's language in a way that I learned to speak and understand the way that dogs view the world and process information. And what it does is it affirms me in a theory that I have in the back of my brain, that within all of this crisis and tough stuff and misery, that what it's doing to us and for us is forcing us to start going back to what we came from faster than we ever realized. And by that, I mean that I do believe that the senses that the animals that I work with rely on every day are things that we've forgotten. And what that points to is community. With horses, just a little known factoid, they can sense your heartbeat even 4 feet away from you. So there's no fooling a horse. And unlike people with dogs, you can put on a happy face and kind of get away with some of that when you're working with a canine. You can't fake it with a horse that weighs anywhere from 900 to 1,500 pounds. And so you better start breathing with them. You better start smelling what they smell, looking where they're looking, and pick up on the most subtle things, like the shift of an eye, that communicates where safety is going to be found within the herd. And it teaches me that we can't live our lives just out of our heads. We have to use it all. That we were gifted with these things for a reason. And horses and dogs don't live out of their past the way that we do. They live in the present moment. The past impacts them, but they can never, ever not live in the present moment. And that's what we need to do. We need to be able to smell and see and hear the person that's right in front of us right now. Not think about what we're doing an hour from now or who we were with yesterday and how that has some bearing on today. It's what is right in front of you right this minute, Mary, or anybody else. It's like, what are you missing? We live our lives as though the next life is something to be gotten to at the expense of this life. And a pastor that I had as a kid growing up used to ask the question, but he did it in regards to asking for money for the church every year. But he would always start out with this phrase, are you going to be a stranger in paradise? And it's caused me to think about, where is paradise? It's right here, right now.
It has to be here.
It has to be. I have to share. I have to look to others to support me as I support them. And so it's through the animal world and the world of plants that I go to be reminded of the importance of that. It's like, because literally, especially when I'm goofing around with the horse, it could cost me my life if I don't.
Yeah,
Actually took the words out of my mouth. On earth now as it is in heaven.
Yes.
Took the words right out of my mouth. I'm mindful of the fact that I promised you guys all time to ask each other questions, but I also promised the audience time. So we're going to get to the audience and then we can swing back around if we have any time, because we have about 15 more minutes. So if there are any audience questions, if you could type them over in either in the Q&A or the chat at this point, I'll get to them. I'll pay attention. If you had any questions for the panelists or all of the panelists.
Hey, it won't take too long to type. Can I ask my question out loud? Because I'm visually impaired. I use a screen reader. Is that cool?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I heard earlier purity culture mentioned. And as an asexual woman, sorry, I don't know why I'm echoing. So as an asexual woman, shows interest in romance with people of any gender. How can we begin to help the Catholic Church unpack purity culture, so that we can be more inclusive, so that Catholic priests and other people can see that sex isn't explicitly like needed for marriage to still be valid. I just want to see that kind of that. Hearing that mentioned made me think of that question. So it was just a thing. I don't know if any of you have any comments on, but thank you.
Thank you, Destiny. Kasha, I saw you kind of raising your hand. Did you have thoughts?
No, sorry, I was just kind of resting this way, trying to get a little closer. But,
Sarah, the question kind of went in and out. What was the broad gist of it?
Kasha, do you want to summarize? I was having a little bit of trouble hearing, but I think Destiny was talking about being an asexual woman.
A purity culture. How can we unpack that as a church, or help the church to unpack that? Because I did hear that mentioned, and it's something that I don't hear mentioned very often in religious spaces. So, thank you.
That's an excellent point. It's the area I don't even think we talk about in Dignity a lot. So,
well, again, I think I was the one that brought up the purity culture thing. You know, that was because I brought it up when I was talking about that passage from Mark. And again, it's this idea that you're, you know, separating people, you know, again, who's in, who's out, who's clean or who's dirty. I mean, whatever those terms mean. And I think the church just needs to get out of that. I mean, because basically that's a judgment, you know, it's a judgment call. And in terms of, and it's also a status thing, it's a class thing, you know, it's just, again, it's divisive. It's maintain, you know, it's just to separate people, and you know, and again, that's been a disaster for the church. The church needs to get out of the judgment business once and for all. Any judgment comes from God, period. Leave it to God. You know, it's just, and you know, and I believe God is all loving, all merciful, and so it's, you know, it's a moot point. But I mean, it's just, all it does is turn people against each other. And again, it's that us versus them mentality I talked about. Behind all that is this idea you have to categorize people, because then you can control them. And that's what the church, of course, has done for, you know, for almost its whole time. And I think we as Dignity represent the anti version of that we're saying we've been victimized by that. It's not right. It's not, God created us to be who we are, and that's good enough. That's it. We're all human beings. We're all children of God. It's the great equalizer, the leveler. That's all that matters. Any other distinctions are human distinctions, and as it said in Jesus said in the Mark passage, those need to go. The only thing that matters is God's love and acceptance of us as we are, as God created us to be, period.
Mary, did you have thoughts as well?
The thought that kind of leapt to mind is, and I think we live in in the perfect time for it. Again, I'll mention technology, but because science and archaeology and all manner of exploration are not just opening our eyes to other ways of seeing things, but there's the ability to spread it quickly and make it accessible to everybody. And I think the more that we open our own hearts and minds to the wisdom of other cultures and how they have viewed people who were different, they were celebrated, you know? It's like they were the wise people, the healers, you know, to look at that and go, yeah, you know, it's like, and I'm not good right off the top of my head, but the more we open ourselves up to those possibilities, that there are other ways of doing things, that there have been all along, and that they are just as valid, if not more so, than the puritanistic culture we find ourselves in now, that just decimated the First Nation that was here. We had so much to learn, and what did we do? We killed it. Rather than wrapping our arms around and accepting as we should, we destroyed. And we have that in ourselves, and we need to own it, but we also need to say that's not the way to do it, and to lead the way, as I think we do within Dignity.
Okay, did anybody else have any questions? Audience questions?
I have one on that last question before we move on, and I'll keep it really brief. But as a young woman in the church, I think when I think about the way that I have discerned, the way that I have processed, the way that I have experienced my own sexuality, being it sexual acts or my sexual orientation, I think that it often comes coupled with emotions of shame, exploitation, and grief. And I think that as a young woman, being a whole person in the church, in my sexuality and coming into that, the church really does a lot of harm there, even if the most of that harm is just absence. And what I really appreciate about the question is bringing in this component of what being asexual could offer to this pain. So that question struck something in me that felt a little bit like a glimmer of healing or hope, because I see my asexual friends and community members really showing me that intimacy and healing and relationship can be, all of those things can be sacred in a way that doesn't have to come at what I have associated, what I have been conditioned to associate with vulnerability and exploitation and harm. And so I think that that's a real gift of some of the folks in this community, to say that there is space and there is capacity for intimacy and capacity for love and engagement and romantic relationship that can be healing and that can be whole, and it doesn't have to come at the cost of sexuality in the way that I've been taught. So I really appreciate that question, and I really appreciate you being here. I believe it's Destiny that asked that, so thank you.
Yeah, I ditto what Kasha just said. I really appreciate Destiny's question. Did anyone else have any questions for the panelists? Peggy Burns, are you trying to speak?
Yeah, it looks like she was going to speak.
Or, maybe she took. Okay. Oh,
no, there's something in the chat box.
Okay. So David Hull, while we get there, I had a question. How do we as white people move past guilt in order to build more inclusive communities? I should say those of us who are white LGBTQ Catholics, which is not everybody in this conversation, but as many of us are pigmentally challenged, as Brian Massengill put it.
I want to say sit in it. I agree that there are ways that we need to move past it, but I think moving past it means acknowledging it. That's going to look like lament. That's going to look like lament in our spiritual communities, in our civic communities, in our educational spaces. It's going to look like lament and grief. And I think those emotions can be really shameful, because you have to admit a certain level of harm, and you have to admit a certain level of complacency. Those things are not comfortable to do. The church has not given us an example of how to do that. And I think that that's going to be the next right step, and the first step is acknowledgement, grief, and lament.
Thank you, Kasha. There's a term I learned in one of my classes called a possessive investment in whiteness. The author is George Whitz. I think I'll type it in chat. That talks about what I gain as a white person and what I've gained. And I've just begun to learn to unpack some of that and acknowledge that. And I think that's a big component of this before we move past it, like Kasha said, acknowledgement. Mary or Brian, do you have?
I think guilt can be healthy. But don't confuse guilt with shame.
Right.
And I think that with guilt, how long do you have to pay? When can you accept that you paid enough by being guilty, and now you're ready to take the next step into fully letting go of that to move forward? Because the more that we hang on to it, the slower we move. Does that make sense, Brian?
Yeah. I mean, and I was going to say, for me, again, it's been as a white male, it's been a process of education. And what I've done is and not just intellectual stuff, although I've read, all the books and all that stuff, but but actually, like, I've attended Black Lives Matters meetings, and I've spoken with people. I mean, and you know, people of color, and to hear their personal experiences and stuff, and that I have found incredibly, you know, enriching, but in the sense, but also, you know, again, realizing, you know, I'm complicit in some of the pain and suffering they've endured or whatever. But again, hearing it from people, listening to people is so key, and and especially when it's unpleasant news, which is largely what this all is. But yet, again, hearing that and realizing it, you know, it makes me, it helps me, you know, to want to be better and to be more accepting of people in general, which is something. I have a Germanic background, so I have been, you know, I'm at a disadvantage to start off with, but again, it's just this process of being educated and listen and to not resist. And so I don't know. And it's an evolving process for me. So.
I think some of it too, and the choice of words is going to be poor, and so I apologize ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a letting go of the whitewashed history that we were taught, to be willing, as you said, Brian, to listen to other people's stories, but to seek out the not so pleasant history that we have been presented with and accepted, because we didn't know any different. But there's an opportunity to know differently in a very large way now. Even though it's not necessarily popular, I think it's absolutely necessary and crucial to moving forward.
And I just want to add that while those other stories are often critical, and rightly so, of you, as you mentioned, Mary, about, you know, the kind of whitewash history we've literally been given, but also these other stories and histories, and, you know, as in our nation, they become part of us, and they have perspective and ways of seeing and doing things that are so different, and yet maybe ways, you know, to ultimately help us to deal with, you know, the problems that we have to, you know, that we're always struggling with. And so they become a part of who we are. So it's criticism, but it's enrichment also. So I find, you know, that I can see it gives a different point of view, a different worldview that at times I found very helpful. So.
Well, thank you to all our panelists. And that last question I forgot to say actually came from David Hull. And so thank you for that, because it got me to some of what I would think I would want us to be careful as we critique the larger church, and as we talk about the lessons that dignity can bring to the larger church. I want us to be careful to think about how Brian offered us some really powerful critiques in his keynote of dignity, and how we can be a more inclusive, and how dignity can become a transfigured church as well. So thank you to all of our panelists. I'm really sorry that we couldn't get Deb in here. I'm going to talk to the team about how we can maybe get some of Deb's thoughts, what she would have said, out to the attendees as a whole, as maybe an addendum, a video or something, so that we have her thoughts, because I know she had some really powerful thoughts from her work at Future Church on this question of creating a more inclusive ministry. So to get back to main session, all you're going to do is you're going to click on the stage icon over on your left-hand side. And then I think we have about 15-minute break, if I'm correct. But just click on the stage icon and stay in there. Your cameras will go off while we're in that larger stage section. But thank you very much. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good seeing everybody.
For sure.